Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Welcome to another episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host is Vicki Goldstein from the Inland Ocean Coalition.
Hello, everyone.
On Monday, January 6th, President Biden, in one of his final acts in office, banned future offshore oil and gas drilling leases on more than 625 million acres of coastal waters, including the entire East Coast, West Coast, the Eastern Gulf of Mexico, and the northern Bering Sea. He did this using presidential powers granted under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act of 1953, which, in 2019, a federal judge in Alaska ruled cannot be rescinded by any future president. Still, President-elect Donald Trump has pledged to, quote, unban it immediately when he takes office. To talk about what these new protections mean for the nation, we thought we'd invite a former guest from 2020 and longtime friend of ours, Richard Charter. Richard's been a leader of the national fight against offshore oil drilling for over 4 decades, as well as having played a key role in establishing California's National Marine Sanctuary. So, Richard, before we get into specifics, just tell us, how did you feel on hearing this announcement in terms of really your life's work?
Well, this has only taken 48 years of work on the part of virtually every coastal member of Congress from the affected states, all the local elected officials, the commercial and sport fishing industry. And we've known this was probably going to be one of Biden's departing conservation actions for the last couple of months, but we couldn't talk about it because talking about it would have made it go away. And we didn't know which day. So we had press materials prepped and everything ready to go. And so 6 a.m. Pacific time, Monday morning, it was happening. And I think the oil industry might have been caught a little off guard because they're having a panic attack. And I think President-elect Trump was clueless. So he just off the cuff said, well, I'll undo the ban on day one, not realizing that he himself had used this same law when he was running for re-election to do a similar ban for the South Atlantic states that he thought this might help him carry the election. So it's kind of an itch he can't scratch. He's in a situation where this law works. It's been in effect since 1953. It was first used by Richard Nixon when he went down to the Santa Barbara blowout in 1969 and took a look at the mess and created a closed area off of Santa Barbara. Obama used it to protect Bristol Bay in Alaska, and it's held up in court. It's permanent, irreversible, and it's proven legally defensible.
So you knew it was coming, but still, when it actually came, what were your feelings?
I went to the beach actually first because I knew my phone was going to ring day and night for a week, maybe longer than a week, because today it was announced, we're on day 3, that the oil industry is having meetings with their members of Congress to undo it, figure out how to undo it in Congress. Now, that's a slight problem for the Florida delegation because in Florida, you do not talk about offshore drilling. You do not think about offshore drilling. The Gulf Coast of Florida, which is where the oil industry would really like to drill, has the most important U.S. live fire military use of the ocean anywhere, and it's irreplaceable. So the Department of Defense is not going to allow offshore drilling on the Gulf Coast of Florida. So,
and also Trump protected that area.
He did. And so
he's kind of a contradiction for him.
There are a lot of contradictions coming out of the mouth of the president-elect. I respect the office, but of course, the story's now been subsumed by the fact that we're going to annex Greenland, Panama, and Canada. So
right.
Everybody's busy with that. But this is the thing I learned early in the environmental world is when you think you're winning, it's most important what you do next.
This has been a battle that's been going on for, in your life, 40 years.
Decades.
48 years to be exact.
Amazing. We've touched on a few tiny little things. The biggie is Trump says, on day one, I am going to reverse that. So Take us a little bit more into detail about what it would take if he were to reverse it. And does he even truly want to reverse it in the areas that he already banned offshore oil development? Talk about the complexity of all of this.
Well, there's facts. The facts are that we know that offshore oil drilling creates economic and environmental downside for the communities where it occurs, and they're substantial, and they can become fatal to local economies, as we learned in the Deepwater Horizon. Ironically, this week, a study came out, latest information from the Deepwater Horizon aftermath. The ecosystems in the Gulf of Mexico are still in deep trouble from all the dispersant and all the oil that was dumped into the Gulf. So, and facts are that local officials, state officials, members of Congress, bipartisan, Republicans, especially in Florida, oppose offshore drilling. They had been writing letters to Biden for the last 6 months saying, do this before you leave. And he did. And the law that was utilized is called Section 12A of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. This is the enabling act that gives the federal government control over the ocean beyond 3 miles from shore in most states, a little further off of Florida, but it's the federal waters. It's a huge area. And using that, Biden was able to make the most consequential conservation decision probably since Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, and the only thing I can think of that compares is the creation of the national park system. This is the oceans protected for in perpetuity for future generations and all the economies that depend on that.
And this is not just for the Department of Defense, although, of course, they need those waters for their exercises, but its whole economy, so that hardcore MAGA Republicans like Nancy Mace in South Carolina and Senator Marco Rubio in Florida have to respond to their own constituents who don't want offshore oil and got President Trump to ban drilling in their areas. And given the thin majorities in Congress, it seems pretty unlikely that folks, as you say, from the Florida delegation, where tourism's so essential, where people live on those beaches, are going to create the majority that it would take to reverse this in Congress. No.
Yeah, they don't want to. Their tourism business is so strong, and their fisheries and their whole lifestyle is about clean beaches with gorgeous vistas and views. So how's this going to flesh out?
Well, over the course of a 27-year period that ended with the departure of the second Bush administration, Congress had renewed an annual moratorium banning funding at the Interior Department to be expended on leasing in these same areas. 27 years of congressional consensus, bipartisan. And was no surprise that there was these areas. There's broad agreement that these are the areas that need to be protected. It's interesting that you mentioned Marco Rubio. It's interesting that the media has mysteriously been unable to reach him for a comment as of day 3. And I think he's hiding under a beach umbrella somewhere. Rick Scott has said that this is an inappropriate place off the Gulf Coast of Florida because of the military space use conflicts are irresolvable, and probably has something to do with his love for that piece of coast and his personal connection to it. So in Florida, the electorate voted to ban offshore drilling in Florida state waters permanently as part of their constitution. Well, that's where the public stands. This is a game-changing issue. In Washington, D.C., it's always been called the third rail issue. And this is an issue you don't touch or you lose your seat. And so it's kind of like the law is crafted in such a way that enables a president to ban drilling permanently. But the courts have decided clearly that you cannot have the next president undo that. Once this is done, it's locked in. So fortunately, it got a lot of brilliant media coverage the day it happened. There were no school shootings that day and no truck attacks. There was a snowpocalypse in Washington, but that didn't slow down the press coverage. So it was about the second most watched story globally that day. So the world now believes America's going to take care of its sustainable coastal economy.
You'd mentioned the ongoing effects from the 2010 BP disaster. I was just up in Cordova, Alaska, going out with the fisherman who was pointing out the coves where the oil is still 2 inches to 2 feet below the surface of the sediment, and telling me how there used to be a whole herring economy before the salmon season began, and the herring returns are still 10% of what they were before the oil spill 35 years ago. So when you started this campaigning 48 years ago, it was mostly offshore oil was a threat because if it spilled, it was destructive. Now, even used as directed, it overheats our planet and acidifies our ocean. So you're pretty confident sounding that this is the end of at least new offshore drilling, although it will continue in the Western Gulf of Mexico.
I'm not complacent, but I do believe this is defensible. We have very good attorneys. We have a very good piece of the legislative language is clear. And of course, it was in response to congressional requests, letters, formal letters asking him to do this. And it's been widely praised and still being widely praised, obviously, not just by the conservation community, but by coastal businesses and all through the constellation of coastal dependent economy. This is hailed as the survival of the coast and its coast-based economy into the future. And of course, what does the president-elect talk about every other day? Strengthening the economy. Why would he attack a cornerstone of the economy? So I think it's going to take work. I think it's going to take faith that the process can be made to function properly in Washington, which is getting harder and harder. But if you look at individuals in the Congress, like, for example, where I live, our congressman is Jared Huffman. He was just named ranking minority of the House Natural Resources Committee. That's a powerful seat. He obviously is one of the strongest advocates for this kind of protection in the entire Congress. He's ranking minority of the committee that is the on-ramp for anything that has to do with this. And if the Congress flips to Democrat, he is most likely, no guarantees, but probably the chair. So he's standing at the on-ramp right now. And so it's not going to be easy. And if the Republicans decide to try, it is going to extract a very substantial political toll on the party. Are they willing to pay that? I don't think so. I mean, if you look at the first Trump administration, when Trump came in the first term, he said, I'm going to open 90% of the Outer Continental Shelf to offshore drilling. First thing he said. His Secretary of Interior at the time, Ryan Zinke, immediately said, except for Florida. So if everybody hides their state behind Florida right now, I think we're okay, because the amount of oil in these areas is inconsequential. It's not, the oil industry hasn't bid on these areas. They're not interested in these areas. In California, we have basically made it impossible for them to come ashore. Local communities have 24 onshore ordinances that say you either can't build an onshore facility on the shoreline, or it would go to the vote of the people if you did, and we all know how that vote would turn out. It's a deterrent effect, chilling effect on bidding. So if you can't drill in these areas anyway, and the oil industry has a lead time of about 40 years planning, and once they get the green light, it takes them about 10 years to get anything built, just because of their own supply chain, nothing Trump does will actually affect this. In other words, the issue lives on beyond his term.
And it's also one of the last bipartisan issues, protecting the coastline. It's like Ralph Nader told us that no one goes to the beach with their family, and if they see an oil spill, goes, oh, I'm okay with that because I'm against regulations. This is a widely supported issue that you've been fighting for almost half a century. At the same time, the U.S. today is still the world's largest producer of oil and gas. So we may be protecting our coastlines, but the larger issue of fossil fuels remains.
I know we're 13 million barrels of oil a day. Like, we produce more oil right now than pretty much any
other nation,
country, any other, including Saudi Arabia. So it's not like we are negatively impacting our fossil fuel economy. We are keeping it strong. Which
is another problem in itself.
Yeah, we are. I mean, at this point in time, I mentioned facts. I think that about 1982, we began to try to talk in Washington and Congress about climate warming. And damage that was anticipated from climate warming. Of course, Exxon and all these companies were trying to say climate's not a problem. It's not related to burning fossil fuels. That ship has sailed. I think everybody knows that if we don't deal with climate in some constructive way, and that's going to be a combination of conservation and energy efficiency and new types of transportation, that we're not only wrecking the coast, we're wrecking the atmosphere. And I don't think there's any debate about that anymore, unless you got an ostrich mentality with your head in the sand, like certain people at the White House, but the new White House. But the bottom line is, this is now not just a problem for beach communities, it's global, it's national. And we have inland states, thanks to Vicki and her work, and others that now oppose offshore drilling because the coast of Kansas is in Southern California or in Florida. A lot of the debates have been already had. These are the areas that the consensus said protect these areas.
Right. And Alaska Native communities up in the Bering Straits region have been, like you, fighting offshore oil since the 1980s. So that's why President Biden included the northern Bering Sea as one of the protected areas.
Correct.
Although, again, they still face threats from Russian oil transport through their waters. But it's to say there are still problems is not to say this is one of the most impressive environmental victories in our lifetimes.
It is. And you mentioned Prince William Sound and continuing ongoing signals from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which of course was a tanker, but it was predicted that would happen. Not that Captain Hazelwood would get drunk and run it on, let his staff run it onto the reef, but the fishermen knew that was going to happen. And we here in California, we just a few years ago had a Long Beach offshore oil spill, which is still being cleaned up. And consequentially, this industry keeps having accidents. It's tragic. It's ridiculous that they can't be precautionary enough not to have accidents, but they do. So if Congress decides to take up something about offshore oil, if it's not the study that comes out and says, well, there's still damage going on today from the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico to the entire ecosystem is poisoned, or another accident, God help us, there's one right now across the planet going on, and a couple of tankers broke in half. I mean, this industry has a very bad track record and averages each year enough highly publicized mess to not make anything they might do in Congress very popular.
Do you love the salty characters and ocean champions we have on the Rising Tide? So do we, and we're dedicated to bringing inspiring stories and voices that make waves. But here's the catch. We need your support to keep the tide rolling. A tax-deductible donation at bluefront.org will help keep the Rising Tide on the air and online. If you're ready and able to amplify these salty voices for the sea, dive in with a donation, big or small. Visit bluefront.org and join the movement. And now, back to the show.
Richard, I noticed that there's been a lot of comments from American Petroleum Institute and other entities representing the industry saying this is a terrible thing for us. It's going to really hinder our ability to save money at the gas stations, and the American people should rally and fight this. What is really happening with the industry? Are they really opposed to it, or is this something they feel they need to say?
Let me get my violin. The large players in the U.S. oil industry offshore are using right now deep water, high pressure, very hot reservoirs, very similar to Deepwater Horizon, tapping those, and it's just a huge cash cow. The rate of production is off the charts. So they're just raking in money from where they have already been allowed to drill in the past, and that'll run for 30, 40 years, who knows how long. They are not in trouble, and they have not bid on. What are you going to do? Bid off of Mendocino or New England and have the state, the locals, and everybody get pitchforks and run you out of town? It's not going to happen. So they're crying crocodile tears. They didn't complain very much when President Trump banned, with the same law, drilling off the South Atlantic. Everybody praised him, and the oil industry was strangely silent. So the oil industry, they're just part of a public relations game, same public relations game that said, well, we have no climate concerns from oil production and consumption. But this industry, it's the search for oil, it's the extraction of it, it's the refining, and it's blowing it out, the smokestacks of factories and the tailpipes of hydrocarbon-based automobiles that is killing the planet. There's not a debate about that anymore. So most of the debates that they're using are trying to dig up old debates that have already been had long ago. And they're back and fill. They're covering up climate is not working anymore. It's just not. So we may have a 4-year term of the presidency in which we have to keep the faith. We have to be careful what we believe out of the White House. I'm personally not going to believe that we're going to take over Greenland, Panama, and Canada on day one. But there's going to be a number of issues in which we have to stay centered. Yeah. Remember that we came here to protect this coast. And I see all over the country, you're seeing it, I'm sure, both of you, the movement that has protected this coast to date is revitalizing, reorganizing, and reactivating as we speak. And it's a political force. It's not Republican. It's not Democrat. It's always been bipartisan. And it's an economic force. Businesses are in alliances that are fighting this. You hear from them. They ask for this from the president. And so I think what we need to do is just keep a good overview for 4 years and make sure that any congressional action gets the proper response, which will be to clean up the Congress. If Trump owes the oil industry for money they put into his campaign, let him pay it back some other way. But if he feels he needs to pay it back, but not this way, with this sacrificing America's coastline, that would be stupid and politically very costly.
And you think that this protections now will be permanent and will be part of Biden's legacy as a climate and environmental president?
He's done a lot of good things for the environment as a president. Biden, of course, was one of the early supporters. People don't remember this, but when we first were doing the Outer Continental Shelf offshore oil annual moratorium in Congress, he was one of the supporters of it back, we're talking early 80s. So he has a history with this issue. He was in California this week designating 2 new national monuments with very significant tribal connections. It's a cultural heritage protection. This has been something that every president, with the exception of Ronald Reagan, every president, both Bushes, they've taken care of our coast. I don't think you can not take care of our coast and find yourself in a politically viable situation. So this is eventually Trump is going to wake up, and it won't be the alarm clock going off. It'll be the political alarm bell. Don't touch the coast. That alarm bell will be loudest in Florida. It's already ringing. I hear it. He threw the alarm out the window. He threw the alarm out the window, but it's his home state now, and Mar-a-Lago is there, and he's going to have to figure it out that the political cost is greater than any kind of benefit he could possibly get.
Is there a way that Trump could somehow fragment this order that Biden put in to pull out some of the coastal areas, or is it a 100% complete package deal?
Well, we're watching that very carefully. It would be virtually impossible. We're interested to see the legislation that was in the news in New Orleans this morning about how the Republicans might try to undo this in Congress. So really what we're seeing right now, I think, is the beginning of sort of an internal fight among the Republicans over this issue, which is great. I say give them more coffee.
And with this permanent ban, the great executive orders and legislation, it's always an inside-outside game. And you've been organizing the outside forces, the public pressure since the 80s, early 80s. And I guess there's just got to be a great sense of satisfaction, caution always, but satisfaction that when you look out from your ocean bluff home in Sonoma County, you realize that not only our ocean, the Pacific, but all our coasts are now protected.
Peter Douglas said it, very former executive director of the California Coastal Commission, said, our coast is never protected. It's always in the process of being protected, always in the process of being saved. And this is a dynamic environment. We all know that. And it's a dynamic politics. And it is as a political space, the America's coastline, people love it. I don't know what it is. It's in the heart. It's not just rational. It's emotional connection between most Americans and the coast. It's just there. And if you run against that, you risk severe damage politically. And I think we're going to have to demonstrate that again. I'm surprised that they don't remember that. But I think they're being reminded as we speak. This was a very popular decision, obviously, from the reaction this week to the president, what the president did. The rollout was handled brilliantly, and there is nobody except the oil industry and a couple of members of Congress that they own and operate that's in favor of taking it away. So bring it.
Well, I'm delighted. David is delighted that we have these coastal protections and that we won't see any new offshore oil development in our current protected areas. Richard Charter, gosh, lifetime hero of our coast, expert on the outer continental shelf, and person I always look to, and I need updates on what's happening within our country and offshore oil development. Thank you so much for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by Blue Frontier's David Helvarg and Vicki Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with production support from Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, Natasha Benjamin, and Nick Paz, and editing services provided by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May. You can find Rising Tide at bluefront.org or on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcast. And don't forget to recommend the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast to your friends and other ocean lovers.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the Blue Frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the Blue Frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky. There you are. Good boy, Sparky.